Without much further ado, I'm going to pass over to Pip. So if you want to get your slides happening, Pip. So at the slide, we've got Pip Band from Band Consulting. Pip's a consultant with a background in communications, public policy and sustainability. And Pip worked with Pollinate and Edge Consulting to undertake research to better understand the benefits and impact of carbon farming in 6 southwest Queensland council regions, where there's historically been a lot of carbon farming projects undertaken. And the work's been used to develop a framework to better understand the impacts of carbon farming. So thanks very much, Pip. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Pleasure. Has my screen come up? Everyone can see the slide?
Yeah, looks
okay,
good.
Great. And apologies to Rachel and Chris. I think you guys have heard this a number of times, so bear with me. So as Rach mentioned, I'm one of the leads on a project. It's been running since about June last year, so it's been quite an extensive project, and we've been establishing a reporting framework to understand the benefits or disbenefits or co-benefits of carbon farming in the southwest Queensland region. And the project's been a consortium, if you like, between Pollinate, a research agency, myself, and also Edge Consulting. So the project really came about due to, I guess, not extreme, but anecdotal stories about the impact of carbon farming in some communities, both from the positive to the negative and kind of everything in between. So our study's been looking to develop a framework of objective data to inform stakeholders. And given it is still a relatively new industry, the benefits, co-benefits and disbenefits haven't been widely researched or documented, especially looking at, I guess, the social impact of all these changes. So our brief was to look across environmental, social and economic at both the individual landholder, but also the community and broader societal impacts. And our methodologies involved landholder, stakeholder, expert, in-depth qualitative research, a desktop review of frameworks from around the world on various environmental schemes, of which there weren't many, and also the largest landholder survey on the impacts of carbon farming in this part of the world, and a really deep dive into available data sets to report against the identified and agreed indicators. So for those that are not familiar, this is the region we were looking at down here in southwest Queensland. So it took in the councils of Baloo, Quilpie, Murway, Maranoa, Balone and Paru. So whilst we designed for this specific region and did it through all of those in-depth interview and approach, it's likely, and we believe this framework is relevant and could work in other regions. The two carbon farming methods that are most prevalent in this region that we focused in on is human-induced regeneration method, which had the bulk of projects. And you might be aware that was expired at the end of last month, so there won't be any further projects under HIR, and also the native forest from managed regrowth methods. And these two are focused around regenerating native forests and had wide uptake by the farmers, but also in this part of the world when it first came in by carbon developers who bought up farming land for projects, which was met with some very mixed reviews in the community. So some information about the farms in the region. As part of our survey, most properties were above 40,000 hectares, almost 50% of landholders own one property, a smaller percentage, 40% with two or more. The majority of those that we surveyed lived on a property that they owned. 18% owned a property but lived elsewhere, and 17% managed but didn't own the property. I guess, as I alluded to just before, the challenge of what's known as absentee landholders, whereby companies or individuals that come up and bought properties wholly for carbon farming, it remains a bit of a gap through this process because we just weren't able to get to those people or organisations to include in the survey data. So you'll see later on we've picked up some trends through macro data sets, but we've still got some knowledge gaps about exactly the extent of the absentee landholder issue. So just quickly, as I said, we're looking at it not just from the individual. So traditionally you'd look at, I guess, the wider benefit of tons of carbon removed, but also what's the financial benefit at the individual. But we really wanted to look at it as the neighbouring benefits as well in the local community and out to the broader community. from the start, I mean, we obviously realised this was a fairly complex issue, trying to isolate out the impact that carbon farming has had across a number of these societal changes in the region compared to all of the other influencing factors, drought, competing industries, general, population decline, etc. So we needed to understand that complexity and systems dynamics. So very much approached it from a systems perspective. And the primary measurement obviously has always been carbon, as well as those income benefits derived. But there are considerable additional benefits and disadvantages. And you'd be aware in Queensland, they've also developed the Land Restoration Fund that's seeking to value some of those additional benefits. Co-benefits, public and private, we've talked to, and obviously they can be positive, negative, no impact, or a few of them remain unknown. It's just not clear what the impact has been at this point. To date, as we said, the impacts have been anecdotal, but we've sought to move towards qualitatively evaluating what the impact has been. And really importantly is just recognising the considerable overlap between all of these consequences. So I'll share just a couple of slides from our survey as part of the project. So carbon farming in southwest Queensland now provides an additional source of income for 1 in 3 farmers. So obviously it's a fairly significant change as to the way that the region derives its income, and in some ways also its identity as a region. It's moved from a very traditional grazing industry into, now 1/3 at least getting impact through that carbon farming. The size of the impact as far as percentage of farm being used is also, relatively significant, with most farms using more than half of the land for carbon farming and 1/3 using more than 80%. And as I mentioned also, there's also a percentage that we don't understand at this point about, whole properties that have gone under projects. So these are a couple of the insights from the surveys, looking at the difference between non-carbon farmers and carbon farmers in the darker colour and non-carbon in the white. So carbon farmers report relatively lower number of pests, fire and kangaroos on the property in the last 10 years. And I know on a similar call, I think we had a discussion around, well, is that because they're not in those areas? Is that not giving them the chance to observe those? And that's certainly something we've been talking about a bit with the project steering group, and a good theory, I think. It might have even been you, Rachel, that brought that up. And they also, carbon farmers report relatively higher vegetation, farm profitability and soil health. It goes against what we kind of thought. We thought investment in infrastructure and farm machinery would be higher for those that had gone into carbon farming with the new revenue stream coming through, but it was fairly consistent. But carbon farmers reported a decline in weed and pest management and less investment on infrastructure. And you'll notice carbon farmers reporting higher bushfire management as well, less livestock, which isn't surprising because a lot of the methods require a change to the livestock management. As per the absentee landholder discussion, the big, concern for the local councils in particular was that carbon farming had led to a rapid decline in population. But what we found looking back over the longer term data is that really it's declining about 1% on a year, and that trend had begun well before carbon farming had commenced. And as a high level, it still is an economic resilient region, and particularly through the survey data, there was extremely high levels of optimism, both in the individual businesses and also the belief that the community was prosperous and was going to do well. So average business income over this time, and I should say the period that the frameworks looked at is 2011 through to 2022, and average business income remained relatively stable, as did gross regional product, which steadily increased. So whilst the qualitative interviews certainly pointed to, numerous stories of individual winners and losers, once we pulled together particularly those macro data sets from ABS, Census, ABARES, ATO as well, at the macro level, there just wasn't data to support economic or social benefits at that macro level. So I'll be able to share the report hopefully in a couple of weeks, and it's got all of the data going back to 2011, as I mentioned, across this framework at both the Southwest Queensland aggregate level and also at each of the 6 council levels as well. So if you're interested, you can get in and interrogate that data, but it's a bit clumsy on a PowerPoint presentation. So I'll just talk to you about the way we've structured the framework to come up with the indicators. So, the brief was environmental, social, economic. And after doing the literature review, we thought it makes sense to use an underlying framework as the basis for this. So we've used the pillars of financial, physical, social, human, and natural. And above that white line there is the private benefit at the individual farm level, if you like, and below the line is the public benefit. So this is the high-level framework, and as I said, the data sets are populated both through our own survey data, and that particularly is across the social and the human pillars, and then also existing data sets, ATO, ABARES, etc., and at that LGA and also aggregate level. So a couple of key examples of differences from the survey work as well that might be useful is in the financial pillar. Carbon farmers are more optimistic about their financial future, but both very, very, very optimistic, 100%. So everything's peachy for the carbon farmers in Southwest Queensland versus 81%, but both of those are considered extremely high levels of optimism. Carbon farmers are also more optimistic about the region's financial future, 87% versus 74%. We've talked about in the physical, we kind of had a hypothesis that the carbon farmers would be investing more back into their own infrastructure, but they were both roughly the same. In the social pillar, back to the issue of the declining population, both cohorts reported declining population, but it was seen as a bigger issue from non-carbon farmers versus carbon farmers. Likewise, both reported declining business communities in the community. But non-carbon farmers, interestingly, are relatively more positive about their community and sense of belonging. And again, we don't understand what sits below this, but it does seem that perhaps it's a more the long-term residents of the areas and potentially a more traditional mindset haven't gone into carbon farming as quickly and have a more entrenched sense of belonging, sense of community, and perhaps resistance to change as well. In the human pillar, we saw non-carbon farmers reporting significantly higher community resilience. Again, we think this is probably the social connectivity of these groups. And in the natural, carbon farmers report greater increases in biodiversity in the area, as well as pest management. Non-carbon farmers reported undertaking more weed management. Probably isn't surprising, but less pest management compared to those with carbon farming. So overall, the research pointed to a bit of a paradox, really, whereby carbon farmers report a number of benefits that are higher than non-carbon farmers, and yet non-carbon farmers report a higher sense of community and regional affinity. And as I said, we don't really know what's driving this, but we believe it could be the result of a more traditional mindset. They're less open to change, risk averse, but also that collectivist, strong community connections and loyalty to the place. So to note really here, and we always try and stress this and really stress it in the report here as well, is when we're looking at the benefits and disbenefits, the reason that we've got such an extensive framework is that this needs to be looked at in a systems view. And there'll be, it's really not a great idea to pick out the one indicator of particular interest and draw simplistic conclusions about what the impact of carbon farming has been. You won't understand the impact doing it that way. So we do need to look at it as an interrelated system and measure that across that system. So to finish, and before we go to questions, what we have really found using this 5 capitals framework is that across all of those capitals, it's really positive or neutral. There's some underlying indicators such as population, I think school enrollments in a couple of others where there are some declines, but at that real macro level, it appears to be a neutral, if not positive, impact on those particular communities. So I might just stop it there and take questions if anyone's got any.
Thanks, Pip.